Alright, so check this out. This is a story of someone I knew and had cut ties with because he was a psycho. The first half will be to add context as to why I cut him off, and the second half is what makes it a let's not meet story. I don't know if he uses Reddit, so I'll omit ages and locations. It started about 4 years ago when I was living in a friend's house while attending a nearby university. It was myself, my friend, his sister, and their parents. Roughly about 2 weeks into staying there, my friend's sister invited her boyfriend to live in the house too, and by all accounts, he was a pretty cool guy at first. Very sociable and full of great stories. We often sat around the table for drinks or talked about life, having a smoke in the garden. Within the first month, however, as he started to get more comfortable, cracks started to show in this veneer. He would rant about government conspiracy, how he was always a wronged party, and he was big into Sigma male bullshit and martial arts, and Christ, did he have a temper. He had this big dog that he always kept in a cage that was extremely violent when he wasn't around. The dog attacked his girlfriend and had to be put down, and that's when the guilt trips toward her began and the ranting became more incessant. About 2 months later, he had the bright idea to live in a shipping container, mainly because the parents wanted him out, and dragged his girlfriend along for the ride. I'm not talking about one of those chic little restoration jobs either. This was a rented container in a storage yard among the outskirts of the town that we were living in. He would intimidate and threaten the staff there constantly until they called the police. This, of course, was another conspiracy. He became increasingly abusive to his girlfriend to the point where the family got involved to get her out of there. I stuck close to them, having pretend to be on his side until we could safely get her out. They broke up, which he blamed me for, claiming I was poisoning her against him to make her mine. She has a new partner now and they're happy. We all blocked the Psycho X on everything possible, but he continued to harass them until eventually he disappeared. Or so we thought. Fast forward to last year. I started to receive messages over social media from several different accounts, blocking each one in turn when I discovered who it was. Some friendly and some hostile. One of these profiles, however, was pretending to be someone I knew from university. We talked about life and how things were going. Eventually, I was invited to a house party, claiming it was a free house and plenty of people were coming. I booked the time off from work, made my travel plans, and kept talking to this friend coming up to the date of the party. I mentioned it to my friend's sister and she was interested in going herself until I mentioned the address and she panicked. The address in question was a property belonging to the crazy ex's father that was scheduled for sale. I waited until the day of the party and called the police to check the property, claiming a suspected break-in. They found 5 people there, including the ex. Parked out the front was a butcher's van equipped for food storage and a collection of knives, hammers, and rope. I'm so glad I didn't go. I've been a long-time reader of this subreddit, so it's honestly kind of surreal that I now find myself writing about an experience that I had very recently. It was a Friday night, and I had gone to bed early as I work on Saturday morning. After reading in bed for a bit, I drifted off at around 10:30, only to wake up about an hour later to loud screams and people yelling profanities. I thought my girlfriend was watching a movie with the volume up, and I went out into the lounge room to ask her to turn it down a little. But the TV was off, and my girlfriend was staring at the front door with her eyes wide. Our apartment is on the ground floor of the building, and so our front door opens directly out into the lobby of the building. The voices in question were coming directly from the lobby. I couldn't make out specifics. I mean, in my defense, I was half asleep, and the language of the country I live in is not my first. But there was a lot of swearing involved. My first thought was that it was some kind of domestic dispute, but after listening, I realized it was a group of men that sounded extremely aggressive. I looked at the WhatsApp chat for my apartment building, and to my horror, I saw a message from one of the people in it that there were armed men in the building and that we should not leave our flats. The country I live in is experiencing a marked uptick in crime, and I had heard stories of armed groups of men robbing entire apartment blocks, but these had seemed fairly apocryphal to me. However, that was my first thought, that these men would kick down our door and rob us. One of my dogs started to growl at the commotion outside. I shushed him, and thankfully he obeyed. I heard a commotion in the apartment above me and went out to my patio to see what was happening. I heard what sounded like a large piece of furniture being knocked over and women and children screaming in terror. At this point, I had no idea what was going on, but I knew that by now they would have robbed us already if that's what they had actually planned to do. My girlfriend and I decided to hide in a small shed at the end of our patio, monitoring the group chat on our phones. Our bigger dog silently stood watch outside the door of the shed, his eyes locked on the sliding door at the end of the patio. I would find my smaller dog later, cowering between the washing machine and the dryer. After about 10 extremely tense minutes, I heard the screeching of tires, signaling what I hoped was the perpetrators fleeing the scene. Eventually, someone in the group chat said that the police had arrived, and breathing a huge sigh of relief, I came out of hiding and opened the front door. Alarmingly, on the floor of the lobby there were zip ties that had been cut, and the security guard was talking to one of the tenants. The man was bleeding from a large gash on his face and looked extremely shaken. Over the next few hours, the story would unfold. The man I saw, with the gash on his face, was the tenant in the upstairs apartment, the one that I had heard the commotion coming from. He was the owner of an import-export business and, for whatever reason, had a sizable sum of money in cash hidden in his apartment. Someone had obviously found out about it and planned out the robbery that woke me from my sleep that Friday night. A group of 8 men had followed him into the apartment building's garage and ambushed him as he got out of his car, and judging from the gash on his face, also roughed him up a bit. Some of the group of 8 had gone to the lobby, surprised the security guard, and zip-tied him. The remainder of the group had gone up to the apartment, robbed it, and then fled the scene. It's extremely chilling to think that armed men were mere meters away from my front door. My parents divorced in 2006. I was 17 when they split right before their 18-year anniversary. It was a long time coming. My dad sustained a head injury 4 years prior, so his drinking and drug use went from a lot to a cyclone of crazy. So my mom risked it and left. Dad left, and we remained in the same house that we had moved to from our small town to a small city near our state's capital. It was weird. But the first month he was gone, we had a peace that we never knew we could have, and I remember feeling actually free for the first time in my life up until that point. My dad had to be supervised by state police when he collected his stuff, as he was violent and threatened to kill me on several occasions. He never cleared out the basement, but left garbage, so my mom, myself, and some friends that hung out at the time helped the cleanup effort, and we ended getting overall $200 in return from all the beer cans. My friends and I got different furniture, instruments, stereos, and a fridge to put in soda and beers as we took over the garage in the basement. My friends and I discovered my dad had been growing weed in the basement as he left all of his plants and equipment behind. At the time, that was illegal in our state. My mom has a job where she could get fired and lose her license as well. My friends and I didn't want to get involved with selling any of it, and we honestly were just interested in having fun on our own terms. We liked to drink, but beyond that, we never got into anything else. So we threw it all out. My dad had told us he got everything and that was it, and I would never have to interact with him. Really, he gave me up during the family court stuff. Or so we thought. Our house is on a hill and borders the actual city, which has alleyway access, which led to the small backyard. The basement access was outside only and was kept with a padlock, and the door itself was pretty sturdy. The house was next to a diner and a storage garage, so everything closed after 5 p.m. And there were other houses on the street as well, and there's a main drag that connects you to a small highway. I don't remember when it started, but I recall my dad would call our house nightly, drunk, and accuse my mom of cheating. As he was already living with another woman at this time as well, he would call crying and just belligerent some nights. Then we started having people prowl around the house. It started very subtly, till my special needs sister started seeing a ski-masked man at her window. I often would chase someone away with a bat some nights alone by myself or watching my sister, as my mom had to work multiple jobs. I started working as well. I would often wait up most nights and just patrol, making sure everyone was safe, and most nights it was nothing. I developed a good layer of trauma from all of this and a caffeine addiction, as I was always on alert. I had suspected a few of my dad's friends, especially since they were very interested in the basement. I'm also not a small person. I'd given up playing football and had trained to play for a D1 school, so I was still fresh from all of that and was still very young and strong. One night in particular, lost my spot. One night in particular, I remember being awoken by my bedroom window being tampered with. I looked and saw a man in a ski mask trying to open my window with a large hunting knife in his mouth. I snuck down to the floor and crawled out of my room and into the living room. I grabbed a Louisville Slugger I kept by the front door. I got my shoes and jacket on as it was winter. I snuck outside and confronted the man who I recognized as one of my dad's friends. He started talking crap and making fun of me as I warned him that he needed to leave or I would hurt him. He took a swing at me with a knife and I pulled back and cracked him on his shoulder as hard as I could, and I heard bones break. I watched his shoulder move in an unnatural way as he fell down in the snow. I got on top of him and started punching him over and over, taking the ski mask off too. My mom came out and our neighbors came as well as he stopped moving and was unconscious. It took my mom and 5 others to pull me off of him, and even they had a hard time. As we waited for the cops, he came to and managed to get up as he tried to run, but was having a hard time. A car came by and he hopped in as it took off before we could stop him. This was before Ring doorbells and most people just had security systems. We all gave our story and the cops took his knife, and that was it. Things were quiet for a while before it started again that summer, and I had cornered that same guy in the dark in the small yard out back. He yelled out that he wanted his equipment from the basement, and I told him we tossed it before he charged at me. I picked up a large brick that we had piled back there and tossed it overhand at him and hit him in the same place that I did months prior, and I heard those same bones break again. This time, I sat on him as he kicked and screamed. My mom called the cops, and they came and actually arrested him. They told me that I broke his collarbone and that he wanted to press charges. Nothing ever came of it, and after which the whole situation ended up blowing over and it all stopped. My dad admitted he was involved and wasn't sorry that he pitted these men against his kids and ex-wife, which has altered my relationship with him. I saw that man during the pandemic as our city had a lot of public gatherings and such, and while I'm not the same person I was still happy to see him have a level of healthy fear when he saw me. Also, another one of the guys involved I had run into as well at some event last year was very cautious around me and referenced that he didn't want me to do what I did to his friend. It felt good to know that as someone who doesn't get violent, that people exist out there who have a healthy fear to never mess with my family or to try to break into my home because there are consequences. I grew up in the 90s, born in the late 80s. I remember getting my first bike and starting to explore the area in which I grew up in upstate New York. Where I grew up is much different now than it was in the 90s. It was more rural with clusters of neighborhoods here and there. I lived near an old capped landfill, and the main road connected a lot of semis down to some factories in a neighboring town that was like a 5-minute bike ride. We also had an old Baptist church that was founded by an eccentric former hippie who was really good to the community. My dad, who was a very serious drinker, loved to fish, hunt, stuff like that. He did that with his friend because it gave him an excuse to drink and to kill something. But he ended up making this deal with this pastor and the gentleman who owned the pond behind the church to stock it with fish, as at the time, my dad and his friends started becoming serious competitive fishers and went in on a boat, which my dad had to sell his share to eventually keep drinking. So my friends and I had permission to fish there in the summer, and we would go down and swim and all that. I lived easily less than 5 minutes from this pond, and my friends and I go out there one summer day. This was about 1995. My friend had heard on the news a week prior about a wave of kidnappings. I don't remember if Amber Alerts were a thing back then, so she decided to make a code word with me. She came to me and told me if anyone ever tried to convince me that they knew my mom or my dad in the hopes of getting me into their car, to ask them for a code word. Ours was pickles. So fast forward to our fishing trips, my friend leaves before me and we sat around and actually just swam more than anything. My friend Dennis got mad because he was serious about fishing, so he and his brother left and I was alone on the road, as the road, once you got past this farm, was a straight shot to the main part of town, and our road was on the right, just before the road ended. So I get to my road and am about to turn around, and I notice I was being followed by a beige-colored pickup with this Cletus-looking guy from The Simpsons in it. He greets me and tells me that my mom and dad are waiting for us at this local restaurant, which I knew. He tells me that they asked him to come get me and to meet them there so that we can all have dinner together. Immediately, I thought of what my mom said, and I started getting this evil feeling like I was in danger. So I told them that my parents specifically have a password and they gave it to their friends. And if that was their friend, well, he would have to tell me what the password is. And at that point, he got mad and started swearing at me. Although I didn't see one, I was certain he had a gun and he was starting to fumble with something in the truck. I turned and started pedaling down my road, screaming for help and that I was in danger. He jerked his truck to follow, but I was making too much noise and was already on my way to my house. He just took off. When I got home, my mom was home and I was hysterical and asked her why she would ask such a mean friend to pick me up. And I told her what happened. She didn't believe me. She calmed me down and told me that I did the right thing, but I could tell she had a hard time believing me still. She also grew up in the same town and nothing like that ever happened to her. A few days later, a friend of hers tells her a similar story about her son in another part of our town. The police then were involved and the cops came and talked to me, and I gave them the same description of the man, the truck, and what had happened, so on. I don't know if the guy was ever caught. I used to be very bitter at my mom for not believing me, but I now understand the confusion that she had, and instead of reacting, she just tried to console me and keep an eye on everything. My dad, on the other hand, was more vigilant about it and would ask me all the time when he'd take me out if someone looked like that guy or if the truck looked like the same one that I saw. I hope no other kids were harmed by him. In my country, the government decided to push free professional classes to anyone who's either benefiting from welfare or just unemployed. I, a 30-year-old female, decided to enroll in one of those classes before moving to another state next year, just to have something more on my CV and to have an excuse to touch some grass since I'm unemployed. And I specifically picked a social media marketing and management formation that started 3 months ago. Everything was great about it, and it seemed to me all my classmates and professors were great people. I even started to make some friends. I must point out that no one in my class is underage, the youngest being 21 and the oldest 56. After a couple weeks of classes, they introduced us to the main curriculum of the whole course that'll involve a months-long group project among the students. The project consists of inventing a brand from the ground up and market it on social media as if it's a real thing about to launch on the market. I was super excited about this and couldn't wait to face the challenge. They picked the groups at random, and the RNG gods chose me to be paired with the 56-year-old woman, we'll call her M, that barely spoke to anyone up until that point. Thinking she was nothing but a nice lady, I tried to accommodate her for any preferences that she'd have on the project, such as choosing what the topic would be about. She immediately starts telling me half of her life story just out of nowhere, and focused particularly about a skin issue that she had and claimed the doctors only made worse, and how she cured herself with herbs and essential oils. After that, she picked the name, idea for the logo, and motto without asking me for an opinion, saying it felt important to her and that since I had no experience with this niche, I should learn from her. She insisted so much I had to comply, and that's when hell started for me. She would call and message me on WhatsApp constantly, insisting to see me work in real time on the designs, logos, mock-ups, and etc., because she needed to supervise my actions. Her excuse being I'm a little girl that hasn't known the world yet. She never liked any of my works and forced me to redo things over and over again. It's in one of those calls that she starts telling me some of the most unhinged things I've ever heard in my life. The first incident, the biggest one, happened last month. On a weekend evening where instead of slaving away for her, I went out with my mom to visit some friends and be back home the next morning. I forgot my phone at home and realized too late, but since Em and I hadn't agreed to work that night, I thought nothing of it. Oh man, was I naive. The phone was blown up with messages and phone calls, all from Em, except a couple of messages from another classmate of mine that told me she called him obsessively with demands of him showing up at my front door to make sure that I was okay. Later that week, I get called into the school admin because Em apparently had called them too and told them that I had gone missing for 3 to 4 days. I tried in vain to keep it together and just burst into tears in front of the secretaries, telling and showing them all this woman was putting me through, explaining my boundary-setting issues, and they decided to immediately inform the professors and find a solution that would have allowed me to not have any more contacts with her. But before they could take any action, me and M are informed one more student was going to join our group. We'll call him T. Nothing much to say about him. He's super nice and did help out that following week by not complying to M's demands and unreasonable standards, insisting that I take time off to do my own things too. For some reason, she never bitched about decisions T made. In my last call with M and T, M goes on another unhinged rant. This one will be relevant later, and it's what makes this whole story messed up on multiple levels. 2 days later, we get informed that I was swapped from M's group to another one. I will say that finally, I'm working with the girl I made friends with, and we're having a lot of good fun. So, well, I thought it was over. No more of M's weird stuff, right? Right? The calls and messages from her never ended. Actually, she started obsessively calling the school and the professors as well to protest about the decision of removing me from her group. At this point, I stopped responding almost entirely to her and screenshotting everything that she was sending me. This leads us to the third and last incident, at least so far. That happened last week. I can't go too much into detail because it involves geopolitical beliefs and I don't want to warn the comments. But the short, clean version of events is M, in class, asked the professor a question that involved a very important global matter. He replied and then asked us about our opinion. 2 people spoke before I did, giving examples of people or brands getting canceled for sharing political stances unwisely, and how a problematic or controversial history or presence on social media might impact negatively one's chances of employment. It was only once I was back home that I realized M had sent me several rage-filled texts claiming I was incredibly rude to have answered to her instead of letting the professor answer, and that she was expecting an apology. I wrote a long text to her explaining myself. I told her that I would not apologize since I'd done nothing wrong, and finally, I blocked her number. Since then, she's been missing all classes, which is nice because I didn't really want her to try and confront me in person. But it's what I've learned today from one of my classmates during break that left me horrified and pushed me to write this post. One of my classmates, we'll call her Y, told me M and her had been exchanging texts from time to time, mostly because Y took pity on M, thinking like I did at first, she was just some weird old lonely lady. In one batch of texts, she goes into detail about her husband that had passed away from cancer a few years back. Some of the texts read, "We fought tooth and nail. We didn't bend over to men nor God, but they took him away from me anyway. I was so close to keeping him with me. At least I know he trusted and followed me until the end." These are verbatim because after putting 2 and 2 together, me and Y, we figured she's either delusional and lying about everything, or she tried to cure her husband from cancer with her ointment instead of traditional medicine, effectively killing him. Also, we found out she's already selling her services inside of an SPA belonging to a relative of hers, using the name she picked for our project. She's also been using my work for her personal social media pages that involve her services, which explains why she was so obsessive about supervising my work. She was basically getting free commissions from me. Today was my last day of class before the Christmas holidays, and after that, it's just going to be the 3 more months until classes are over. I don't know where this story will lead me to any further, but honestly, I hope she never shows up to class again. This submitter includes an update that says, "I don't even know where to begin. I'll have to leave out some details because she went too far with one of my classmates, but all I can say is that her actions affected a minor and M has been reported to the police by the person in question. But it seems the police haven't taken the situation seriously despite being pretty damn serious. She apparently isn't new to this kind of behavior either, since she's had multiple convictions in her life before and some restraining orders against her. But in my country, those are barely ever enforced. Someone is watching me. I've never posted on this sub, though I have other stories that I've buried deep until recently, but this is happening in the present. I've had people stalk and follow me before, and because of that and my true crime addiction, I've become supremely paranoid and a solid curtain twitcher. I'm a 13-year-old female, and I reside in an upstairs bedroom that was my first room as a child. I had to leave a bad situation and therefore ended up back in my childhood home. For reference, when our house was built, we were told that the field to our left, which had horses and a barn at the time, would one day soon be a development. It was 2000 when we were told that, and it wasn't until 2022 that roads started being formed and foundations laid. I'd already had someone follow me home before when I was young, but I was in a different bedroom in a different part of the house. My parents put in a free library that's right below my window, and nighttime security lights that are very bright and turn on if you're within like 20 feet of the side of my house that my room is on. And I'll admit, having an open field next to me so long made me accustomed to not closing the curtains when I change, because there was never anyone to watch. But now there is. For the past 2 weeks, the burglar lights next to the free library have been going off late at night. Because my one side of the curtain is open so I can use my vape, that's the only reason I ever noticed at all. I didn't think too much of it at first. We all lock the doors and windows every night, and I'm on the second floor. I also always looked out to see if it was a car, someone walking their dog, or a deer, only to see nothing. And to add, they put in a shit ton of streetlights around this area, so visibility is great. But it just keeps happening. So last night, I did my usual, and I saw the lights come on out of my peripheral view. I acted natural, giving full view out the window. I was going to bed. It was about 3 a.m. I turned the TV off, I closed the window and the curtains, and I turned the lights out. And then I ducked down, peering through the curtains to the sidewalk below. I honestly thought I was going to pass out when after a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes, someone comes out from the side of my house, all silhouette, dressed in black. They kept their back to me until the light turned off, but I swear I could still see them standing there, looking up like they could see me. I called the police, but while I was on the phone with the operator, I saw him run off. There wasn't much they could do except say that they'd have a car drive around and look. My parents are asleep, and I know I have to tell them tomorrow, and this scares the crap out of me. If it hadn't been happening for weeks, and if it was a solo incident, I would probably be fine about it, but the fact that the light has been going off without me seeing any activity and what happened tonight makes me think that this person has been watching me in my house. Here's a small update. I did tell my parents, and at first they brushed me off, claiming I'd had a couple of drinks and that it was late, so I probably just saw someone checking out the free library. I then had another conversation about it with my dad, who said that there had been reports the last couple of weeks of car break-ins, and since my car is parked on my side of the street, right outside my window, maybe they were trying to break into it. I pointed out that if he was trying to get into my car, why was he pressed up against the house where he wasn't visible from my window, and why did he at no point go towards my car? I think I freaked him out enough that we're going to potentially get a camera for that area. Given all the development happening around us, I think it's smart even without this incident. This person includes an additional update. It says as follows. few days have passed now, and there hasn't been any activity since the night after I originally posted. I was on a phone call the very next night with a friend when I noticed someone standing outside, completely shrouded in darkness. I proceeded to talk loudly about how some creep was watching me and that they'd better watch out. I was stupid, I know, but it seemed to work because all was quiet after that. Or so I thought. Tonight was one of my oldest friends' last night in town, so I was out until about 9:30. I drove 2 friends home and then myself. Since it was still so early in the night, I wasn't that worried, but I was still alert. I drove up the side of the street that he had hit on last time, even though it was out of my way, and I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. I noticed one of the new houses that's being built had its lights on, which I didn't think much of in the moment. Fast forward about an hour, and I start hearing a weird loud banging sound across the way. I know it's risky, but I'm not letting some asshole dictate my comfort, and I've also been watching for any activity so that maybe I can catch them. So I've kept my window open as usual, hence why it was done to razz him the other night by talking about someone watching me. But I digress. It stopped, so I wrote it off. Big mistake. Shortly after, I started hearing the banging again, but this time I could actually feel it. It was coming from my house. I genuinely freaked out, like Knives Out status, but much more cowardly. I'm cowering on my bedroom floor with my ear pressed to the door and a knife in my hand. It was a strange, hollow sound. It didn't seem like the front door. It wasn't. I once again call 911, describing what's happening and thinking that they're probably going to write it off because I sounded crazy. I still feel in shock because this only just happened. Thankfully, the kind dude on the line definitely took me seriously and said someone would be on their way. And for the record, the police department is like a 3-minute drive from my house. I ended up tiptoeing downstairs to see, and once again, I felt my heart stop. I went to the front window, ducked down, and there wasn't anyone at the front door. And then the banging starts again, and I can tell how close it is. I go to the side window that overlooks the garage, and that's when I saw him, dressed in black, hood pulled far over his face, banging wildly on the garage door with a crowbar. I honestly don't know why he wasn't using the crowbar to break in, but I'm super glad he didn't, as the door inside the garage that leads into the house is usually left unlocked. To say I panicked is a vast understatement. I almost pissed myself, which I think is understandable. I'm just standing there, peeking out of the window, watching this guy wail on my garage door with a crowbar, thinking how unhinged he must be and how I want the cops to get there now, when just like before, he runs off. As I'm typing this, I quite literally just got done giving the report to the cops that showed up. My family was woken up and I had to talk to them as well, as they're the homeowners, and now they're both so freaked out that my dad just ordered 4 exterior cameras to monitor the house. I don't think this is over yet. This man has some reason that he's targeting my house, or possibly me, since he started out by watching my side of the window. So, to this man, you'd better hope we never meet. I have a crowbar too. I think I'm being stalked. Recently, I've had several unsettling encounters with a delivery person. Initially, he approached me asking, "Are you so-and-so from so-and-so? You've moved, huh?" And he used my full name and my previous address, while smiled in a way that made me uncomfortable. At first, I brushed it off, thinking he was just making small talk. Living alone, I wondered if I was overreacting by feeling creeped out. Later, I realized he was my neighbor at my previous address. He started a conversation, claiming to know one of my friends. I'm not keen on talking to strangers, so our conversation was brief, but it left me feeling uneasy, as if he posed a danger. Another time, while going out, I saw him delivering to a neighbor. Despite wearing a mask, he recognized me and repeated his question from earlier. After that, I seldom went out, but I did notice him standing in front of my neighbor's house once, and I simply walked past. He also sent me a friend request on Facebook, which I ignored. Feeling increasingly worried, I confided in the friend that he claimed to know. Initially, she didn't recognize his name, but his last name revealed him as the son of a family friend, someone that she'd never interacted with. His family was unaware of his job as a delivery person. He had been fired for obsessing over his boss, who was older than his mother. I also misplaced my keys and requested a replacement from my landlord. Returning home to an open door alarmed me, but thankfully, my apartment was empty. Reflecting on these incidents, I've considered installing CCTV outside my apartment. The thought that he knows my address still frightens me. Here's an update. A friend advised reporting him to the police, but fear of retaliation is holding me back. She mentioned suspicions of his drug use based on family accounts, but for now, my plan is to change the locks and install CCTV. Here's a second update. Thanks to everyone's concern, I feel somewhat relieved. I haven't seen him since, perhaps because his family intervened. I haven't noticed anything unusual around my house either. Feeling safer, I plan to move to a different city in a few months with my dog. My boyfriend's inability to move in with me due to his parents' restrictions is frustrating. I wonder if finding a new boyfriend would be a solution, especially since he doesn't share your concern for my well-being. I almost got kidnapped by a fake hotel employee. This happened when I was 10 years old. I was at a ski resort with my dad, my stepmom, and my 3 sisters. When this happened, my 2 sisters, dad, and stepmom were still out skiing, but me and my sister, Ava, got cold, so we went back to the hotel to get some food. We sat at the restaurant in the hotel until my stepmom came down. We asked her if she could hold the table so we could go up to the room quickly so that we could drop off our ski jackets. So we take the elevator, and once we get off, we start to walk to our room. That's when I hear someone behind me go, "Hey!" Keep in mind, we're both about 11 at the time. I didn't think he was talking to us, so I just ignored it. We walked into our room, but before we can close the door, the same man steps in the doorway. He was tall, probably 6 foot, and looked pretty old, maybe in his early 60s or late 50s, and he was wearing the hotel staff uniform, but just without the logos. The thing that raised a big red flag was that he was wearing black surgical gloves. He says, "Hey, I was talking to you." We spin around, caught off guard, and Ava says, "Us?" And he goes, "Yeah, you. I was wondering if you could grab a pitcher for me and come into my room to pour some water for me." Our parents told us to never trust strangers, and we already got a bad vibe from this dude, so we politely declined. His tone then got a bit annoyed, and he said, "It'll just take a second. Can you please just pour me some water in my room?" At this point, we already knew that this wasn't right, so we said no again. This conversation went back and forth for about 3 minutes until he tried to walk into our room. Our instincts kicked in at this point, and I ran towards the door and said, "Sir, we are good." And I slammed the door on him. Ava and I sat in the hotel room for about 10 minutes, panicking on how we were going to leave to talk to our parents because we had left our phones downstairs. We looked out of the peephole and he was gone, so we bolted down the hallway and ran back down the stairs to the restaurant. Once we told our stepmom, she was mortified and went off to tell security. They interviewed us and asked us for his description because they didn't have any cameras in the hallway. We gave them the description, and they told us that nobody with that description worked there and that most of them were young, broke college students. At this point, it really set in that if I had accepted and just helped him, that I might have died. Someone tried to break into my house and find me. This story took place 3 years ago, around the time COVID started, so it's been a while, but it's still worth sharing. It was early 2020, and I had just landed a new job in a small town near where I lived. While searching for a place to stay, my sister offered to let me rent her house. She and her husband had bought it 2 years earlier, but hadn't settled into it due to their long commutes, so they moved out, leaving the house unoccupied. Fortunately, the house was relatively close to my workplace, about a 40-minute drive. My sister offered it to me almost for free. I only had to cover the water and the electricity bills and maintain the property. After living there for 2 or 3 months and feeling quite at home, one night, upon returning from work and walking towards my door, I noticed a cigarette butt on the curb outside my house. I picked it up thinking that it might have been mine since I smoke, but I realized it wasn't my brand and I discarded it, assuming some thoughtless person just flicked it there. That night passed without further incident. 2 days later, I found several more cigarette butts near my porch, which annoyed me. It seemed someone had used my porch as a smoking area, but without knowing who it was, I felt helpless. The butts seemed fresh, indicating the person had just left as I arrived. That night, while watching a movie on my laptop around 1 a.m., I was surprised to hear a car pass by, given the suburban setting and the COVID restrictions. About half an hour later, I heard muffled voices nearby, which really unsettled me. Stopping the movie, I quietly checked that the front door was locked. As I approached, I froze, hearing the voices come closer, whispering as if plotting a break-in. I braced myself against the door, expecting an attempt to force entry, but all was silent. Curious, I went up to the window, which had bars that could be unlocked from the inside for a better view. Upon opening the curtains, I was shocked to see a man leaning against the window. He stumbled back in surprise, pulling his hoodie over his face, revealing only his wide blue eyes. His accomplice then began kicking the door, but it held firm. Paralyzed with fear, I managed to lock the window bars and retreated upstairs to call the police, barricading myself in the storage room. While waiting for the police to show up, I heard a loud crash and the sound of the window bars being shaken violently. Eventually, one of the intruders screamed in frustration, likely waking up the neighborhood. By the time the police arrived, they were gone. The police increased their presence in the area following that incident, but I no longer felt safe and decided to move out soon after. My sister sold the house a few months later, and as far as I know, nothing similar has happened since. I'm still unsure of their motives or why they were so determined to get in. I think I'm being watched. Ever since I started living at this house, weird things have happened. It regularly sounds like someone is walking on the outside of the house at night, and it's starting to freak me and my roommates out. For some context, this is a college house. There's 4 girls in our 20s just looking for a fun place to live. There have been a few different encounters that have led us to this conclusion, and it only continues to fall into place. Let's go back to the summer when the first break-in was. An evening in September, in the middle of the week, the garage door has never been used by us other than for storage, opened, and one of us was at home with the music blasting. She heard it and didn't think anything of it, but about 5 minutes later, she went upstairs to check and found our garage door open and the back door unlocked. Again, we don't use our garage. She looked around and found nothing missing and figured it was an accident. About a month later, we were having a party. It was around Halloween, and we decided to have a costume party. Around midnight or 1 a.m., someone was in our backyard and turned to see a man walking up the side of our house. When we saw him, he ran away and then up the hill. We also, around this time, had one of our car windows broken. Nothing was stolen, just the window was broken. Last night, while driving around, we noticed a car that we had seen drive by a few times and followed it up the hill. The man in this car was a middle-aged white man with a very receding hairline and arms covered in tattoos. He comes to a complete stop in the middle of the street and turns around to look at us and then pulls to the side of the road. He waited there a few minutes and we waited one street over. We saw him turn left and followed him into the neighborhood in front of ours. We lost sight of him and drove around the neighborhood a bit more. When driving in front of our house, we were wondering if anyone behind could see into our rooms and went to look in the street behind. The house that had direct view into my room happened to have the same car that was driving around our house sitting right in front of it. This car is very distinct. It's an old white sedan with a black shoe mark on the rear bumper. We immediately went back to our house and looked out the window at the house and realized that we had seen someone there before. On multiple separate occasions, there was a middle-aged man standing in the window looking at our house or sitting on the back porch in a lawn chair facing our house. Last night when we went to bed, my roommate had her window open and heard footsteps, heard our gate open, and car doors. The footsteps sounded like they were directly outside her window, and I heard them too. Normally, I wouldn't jump to conclusions, but I feel like these occurrences just connect too well to be coincidental. If anyone has any ideas or input, please let me know, because we're genuinely getting scared. I still don't know what happened on our annual family trip. I don't know where else to go with this, and it still bothers me, so I'm sorry if this isn't exactly fitting for this subreddit. This was maybe 6 or 7 years ago. I have photos on my camera still, I think, but I haven't charged it in ages. I gave up on photography, you know how it is, so I hope that you will just trust me. We've been going on these family trips for a really long time now. Probably 17 years if I had to guess. I won't say where it is we go, but it's the Australian bush, just to give you all an explanation or some kind of idea of the setting. Anyway, we've had a few creepy experiences there, but nothing inexplicable. But this event still weirds me out, and I can't really think of anything that explains it. The year of this event, my sister, my cousin, my dad, and myself all drove up together and were the first to arrive at the house. We had to wait for my grandma to arrive with the key, so my dad sat on the deck with a beer, and my sister and cousin and I went on a little adventure. The three of us made our way to a little creek not far from the house that we nicknamed Bride to Darabithia because of a tree that had fallen and acted as a bridge for us to get across the creek. This creek never had water in it though, and it wasn't deep or wide, and we could easily walk through it, but the tree was still fun. My cousin makes an off-the-cuff comment as we walk across the tree, asking, sort of sarcastically, "Is there something dead around here?" because of how many flies there were. Lo and behold, we get to the other side and there was something dead. We were greeted with a dead kangaroo. Nothing too jarring. I had seen plenty on the side of the road, but this one was cut clean in half. And when I say clean, I mean clean. Like it was a perfect half. There wasn't an ounce of blood on the fur, no blood on the ground, and the top half was nowhere to be found. I happened to have my camera on me. I took some photos of it. Then my cousin poked it with a stick and literally hundreds of flies came out. My cousin and sister kept trying to move it into the creek, but a fully grown kangaroo, even half of one, isn't exactly light. Their sticks broke, so I grabbed it by the tail and pulled it into the creek so that we could bury it, but we really just covered it with sticks and flowers. We looked around everywhere for the top half of the kangaroo or a trace of what might have happened to it, but we never found anything. We ended up going back down into the creek and walking through it looking for something, and what we found only made it even more confusing. We found, if I'm remembering it correctly, 4 dead rabbits, but only their bottom halves, all lined up neatly along the floor of the creek until it reached thick brush that we couldn't walk through. Same thing with these rabbits though. No top halves to be found, no blood anywhere, and cut clean in half. I'm sorry this was way longer than I intended, but I hope you'll read it through and maybe give it some ideas as to explain what happened. And by the way, we still go to this area every year, and we've never seen anything like this again. A stranger tries to steal my dog and other nightmares before Christmas. This happened before Christmas of 2019, when I, female, was 26, and it sticks with me to this day. I've thought about sharing this many times, but I was never sure if it was scary enough, but I don't know, I guess you can decide. My then boyfriend, now husband, and I decided to meet for dinner at a Christmas market here in Switzerland. He would pick up our dog from doggy daycare, and I would get there after work. Here's some things that are good to know. At that point, we'd had our dog for about a year. He's called Bean. He's a medium-sized dog, and before he came to Switzerland, he was a street dog in Italy. He was about 2.5 years old at that time, and he loved and still loves to get all the attention that he can get. Also, Christmas markets are incredibly busy here, especially after work. People will meet here with their friends to eat dinner and drink mulled wine. When we get to this Christmas market, we realized that it was too busy to walk through with a dog, and I sent my boyfriend off to get my favorite street food, malawak. I waited at the edge of the market with Bean. Bean likes to greet everyone who looks at him, and by that point, I had gotten used to talking with strangers because my dog wanted to meet them, so I wasn't too concerned at first when a dude came up to me. Now, full transparency, I don't remember word for word what he said. I'm not even sure what language this happened in. But I do remember that Bean happily greeted this guy, trying to stand up against him and licking his hands. The guy asked for his name and what breed he is, and I told him it's Bean and that he's a pincher mix. That's when the situation started to turn. The man insisted that he must be a Basenji. How could I say he's a pincher? All of a sudden, he switched. There's no better word to explain it. He grabbed Bean's leash and said, "I'll go now," and just tried to walk off with my dog. Thankfully, I had a firm grip on his leash. I was incredibly confused and flustered and just stammered that he can't take my dog. He got increasingly more angry with every second that I didn't let go of the leash. I loudly told him to leave me alone, and Bean started to bark at the man. I've never seen Bean this angry and scared at the same time. And thankfully, the man did let go of the leash and slipped into the crowd. I was left standing there, just a dumbfounded mess with a mess of a dog. Bean was barking and shaking, so I knelt down to calm him down, holding him and talking to him. My boyfriend was still somewhere in the crowd waiting for our food. After a while, a woman walked up to me and told me not to put my heel on the floor as she'd just seen someone put a firecracker there. I don't know the name for this type of firecracker. They're small, like a 1/4 inch, and usually thrown at the floor to make a little pop sound on impact. Someone had put them under the heel of my shoe so it would explode when I put my heel down to get up. Now, I don't know what's worse. Was it the same guy that tried to steal Bean? Or was it someone else who saw a distressed dog and thought, well, let's scare that dog even more? I don't know. I think the worst thing for me was that apart from the woman who warned me, no one helped me when I was being harassed by a weird guy, even though I loudly told him to go away, and there were other people standing very close just watching. Bean was the one who scared off the guy in the end. Thankfully, the events of that evening had no lasting impact on Bean because he still loves to greet strangers. And I still remember it, and I don't think I'll ever forget. The haunting at the brewery. I was reading some true stories on this sub, and I remembered that I'd never shared this one. It's not super elaborate or flashy, but it actually happened. I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. About a decade back, I used to work at a brewery or pub. It was set in a pretty big and old building from the early 1900s. I worked there for a couple of years, and most of the time it was pretty chill, but backbreaking at times. During my time working there, I had 2 experiences that I can only describe as supernatural. The first one, it was a particularly late night, and I was tasked with closing up the hangar and loading docks. Closing it up was making sure there wasn't anything obstructing where the trucks would park, stacking up any loose crates, turning the lights off, and locking it all up. I was about done, so I turn off the lights, and as I'm making my way to the door, a beer bottle comes rolling towards me from the dark between the tall stack of crates. It wasn't forceful or anything. It looked like someone gently placed it on the floor and then rolled it towards me. I didn't think too much of it, so I picked up the bottle and placed it inside a half-empty crate. I turned around, and as I started walking, another bottle comes rolling from the same place, and then another one. Tired and thinking it was a coworker just trying to mess with me, I shout, "Hey, all right, you got me. Come on, I gotta close it up." I expected to hear laughter or something, but instead, it was dead silent. I waited for a couple of minutes, turned on my flashlight, and started looking around the stacks of crates for what I thought would be a giggling coworker. After searching each corner in turn, I gave up. I was a little weirded out at this point, but I just picked up the 2 bottles from the ground and placed them in the same crate as the first one. I turned off my flashlight and I shouted at the darkness, "All right, I'm locking up. See you tomorrow." And just as I finished saying that, a crate full of bottles fell from one of the stacks and landed 2 feet from me. Glass shards and beer explode everywhere. The next day I told my boss about it, and he said it was probably just a rat. The thing is, though, those crates, when full, they weigh about 20 pounds. How could a rat push that? Talking to my coworkers, they told me that they've also experienced weird stuff during closing hours. My second experience happened again when I was closing the place. This time, I was closing the pub. When closing the pub, the last thing you usually do is restock the walk-in freezer. The freezer is probably just as old as the building itself, and it sits underground right beneath the bar. I was down there filling that enormous thing with kegs and crates. Being a very old freezer from a time when safety wasn't a big concern, the thing doesn't open from the inside. There's no handle in there, just a flat, plain steel door. So I did what I always did when I had to go inside that thing, and I put a keg securing the door open. I was halfway through the task when I hear the door slam shut. I rush towards the door, but it's locked. I started pounding on it, but the only other person there was my boss in the office, 2 floors above me. Probably with his door closed too. I tried my phone, but since I'm locked underground inside a steel and lead box, I have no service. I was wearing only jeans and a t-shirt, so things were getting chilly pretty quickly. My face was going numb and my hands were getting stiff. I made a blanket out of cardboard, but it was doing very little to keep the cold at bay. The only reason I didn't freeze to death was because I had a date with a regular and she went there looking for me. She asked my boss where I was, and when he couldn't find me, he went to the basement and found me inside the freezer. I was in there for about 45 minutes when he found me, and I was starting to consider writing a letter to my parents and drinking myself to sleep. My boss installed a chain to keep the door open after that, but I refused to ever walk into that death trap again. The weirdest part? The keg that I had holding the door open was at the other side of the room when I got out. It was a full steel keg, not something that just slides away, let alone quietly. I stopped working there shortly after, for unrelated reasons. Encounter with a witch in an Indian village. There's a history of witchcraft from where I am, and there's numerous witch stories and incidents from centuries ago. The one I'm about to tell is real, and it's one that happened to me. When I was 7 or 8 years old, I used to play with my buddy in a large field behind my house. It was winter when the terrifying incident occurred. The sun was setting at about 5:30, casting an eerie glow over the surroundings. My buddy and I had wandered quite far from home, and a thick layer of fog began to blanket the area. Knowing it was time to head back, we started walking, hoping to find the distant lights of our neighborhood. After a few minutes, we stumbled upon a small area filled with bamboo trees, a place that we'd seen before. In the middle of this eerie grove was a small pond. We grew uneasy as we realized this was the opposite direction from our home. Confused and frightened, we turned around and ventured forward, our vision obscured by the fog. We walked carefully through the dried-up winter rice fields, barely able to see anything beyond our feet. Suddenly, we encountered an old lady on our path. She was hunched over, clutching a dusty cloth that resembled a bag. Her old sari was torn and worn, and she appeared to be a beggar. We approached her, thinking she might be trying to convey something to us, but as she uttered incomprehensible gibberish, a really bad, rotten smell filled the air. Looking up at her, we saw her eyes glowing with a sinister, yellow-red hue, and she began to laugh maniacally. Overwhelmed by fear, we sprinted away, desperate to escape her clutches. After what felt like an eternity, we finally find our homes. Trembling, I recounted the horrifying encounter to my family. My grandmother's face turned pale, and she hurriedly sprinkled ganja water, or holy water, on me, muttering prayers under her breath. She explained that we had come face to face with a daini, or a witch. The next day, I fell gravely ill with a high fever that lasted for a whole week. To make matters worse, my friend contracted a severe case of pox shortly afterward. his condition far more agonizing than mine. The woman in the window. This story happened to my boyfriend, but it's so creepy I had to share. My boyfriend grew up in a small town in India. He lived in a small gated community and he was at the end of the street. Next to his house was a forest. One night he woke up, he took his blanket and pillow to the couch and turned on the TV. He then fell back to sleep. In his own words, he described what followed as an out-of-body experience, similar to a lucid dream. His consciousness seemed detached from his physical form, as if observing himself from a surreal vantage point. There he was, fixated on the television screen, which emitted nothing but a static haze. No TV show, no movie, just static. Strangely enough, he found himself transfixed. He then woke up and felt a wash of fear and quickly walked down the hallway to get back to his bedroom. At the end of the hall outside of his bedroom was a window. He looked out the window and saw a woman looking back at him, standing at the edge of the forest. I asked him what she looked like. He says she was tall, had black hair, and was dressed in white. He said her mouth was hung open. They stared at each other for a bit before he ran into his room. He fell back asleep, and in the morning he assumed it was all a dream. Until he walked out of his room and saw his pillow and blanket in the same position on the couch and the static still on the TV. It gives me chills just rewriting it. My Pennywise animatronic is haunted. Okay, so I posted this in another subreddit, and I know some folks don't believe me, but this is 100% true. I was talking to my friend about it a while ago, and we were both wondering why this entity, that's not a mean entity, would attach itself to a 6.5-foot tall Pennywise the Dancing Clown animatronic. And the only thing that I can figure is it probably was the most human-looking thing at the Halloween store. So, I used to work at a haunted Halloween store. Anyone who worked there often had some creepy story from encountering the ghosts. We had a homeless man with a collection of dolls who lived out behind the store, and he probably wasn't the first or only homeless guy to live there. It was a good spot. I bought an animatronic Pennywise clown from the store at a fantastic discount. I was so excited when I brought him home. He and my animatronic collection bring the neighborhood and me and my family so much joy around Halloween. My house was not haunted, but after we brought him home, weird things started happening. For example, I woke up one night to a clown standing at the foot of my bed. It wasn't just a nightmare thing either. It stayed there after I blinked and jumped up screaming. But when we put Pennywise away, down in the basement, the activity stops. We've had him since 2019, and every time I bring him upstairs, stuff starts happening, like the lights flicker. 2 years ago, the light in my bathroom started going off like a strobe light. My toddler saw it too, and asked if we could shut the door because it was scaring him. It went on and on for like half an hour. One time, Pennywise's eyes were glowing. My husband saw this too, and if I remember right, he wasn't plugged in. This last season, when we brought him upstairs, he moved, turning his whole body toward me while I was sitting in my chair. He wasn't plugged in either. Even if he was plugged in, he's not supposed to move like that. It would have required deliberate effort to move him. Also, a bulb upstairs started flickering like a strobe light and wouldn't stop until I acknowledged it and filmed it. It had a clear rhythm to it and went on for several minutes. I got the distinct impression that he wanted to go back into the basement. I did an EVP and video session when I was alone with my toddler asleep, and I caught distinct rhythmic bangs on the wall next to me. Not anywhere near the room my toddler was in, thank goodness. I also caught a possible light anomaly. Oh, and about the lights. None of these lights ever died or even flickered again after these instances. We put Pennywise back into the basement after Halloween. My husband set him up so he's looking out the window. A few odd things happened, mostly some helpful things. I was looking for something all over. I'd looked in my bedroom multiple times. I go back in there, and there the thing was, right in front of my nightstand, nicely folded, and where I put my feet when I get up in the morning. It hadn't been there before. Music started playing on my phone when I needed to be somewhere, but forgot to set my alarm. You would have had to deliberately push a button to get this music to play. Then it just stopped. It was almost like he was saying, "Thanks for putting me back in the basement, and with a view." And all the instances have settled down. However, when I'm going through a hard time, I'll smell cigarette smoke and alcohol. No one in my house smokes or drinks, yet sometimes the smell is so strong I can taste it. I've also smelled perfume, and no one wears perfume in my house. I have a sensory sensitivity to smell, and most perfumes make me sick. That's when I really wish I had a spirit box. I have questions, but I really don't want to invite anything else into my home. I mean, I'm fine with this Pennywise ghost. Whoever they are, they're not mean, but I don't want anything negative in my home. It's our sanctuary. I don't really know what to do. I guess it doesn't matter. I don't have to talk about it, but I'm just really curious. Back in '98, my best friend Jessica and I were really into ghosts and gore. We would have her dad rent Faces of Death on the weekends, camp out at her house, and just indulge. Working at the video store was your typical video store employee back in the 90s. He's late 20s, single, lives with his mom. You get it. He and his mom lived in the neighborhood for quite a while, so he had all the stories. We would spend hours in the video store looking over videos and conversing with Jim. Jim had all the neighborhood stories. There was this house at the end of my street, which was closer to Jessica's house, that constantly had families moving in and out, all short stays, no longer than a year. Our high school bus stop was directly in front of this home. The longest tenants in the home were a gothic kid and his older mom. They stayed for the better part of a year. While at the video store one day, Jim tells us the story of the house at our bus stop and why no one seems to be able to live in it for an extended period of time. The story goes, there was a party in the house back in the 70s, and supposedly a woman was decapitated, wrapped up in the carpet, and then relocated. Needless to say, my friend and I have to investigate. And by this time, the house is empty, so it's perfect. She spends the night at my house, and we plan to sneak out in the middle of the night to check it out. The time comes, it's about 2 or 3 in the morning. Jess and I, for whatever reason, crawl on all fours down the street until we're a safe distance from my house. We enter the house through the backyard, we passed the pool, and proceeded into the house through the kitchen. The kitchen area is an open floor plan attached to the living room, with the bathroom and the bedrooms breaking off. We were being real disrespectful. I can't recall what we were doing or saying, but it wasn't nice. We walked into the bathroom closet and then to the kitchen and start to smell this horrid stench, something along the lines of rotting meat. We walk into the bathroom and all of a sudden this bright, green orb comes shooting out of the toilet, headed straight towards us. We screamed and ran out the back door, past the swimming pool and past the window of the bathroom that we just ran out of. The entire bathroom was illuminated a bright green color, and we ran our asses back to my house, and we never went back. Real investigation in finding ghosts. The date of this investigation was February 7th, 2022. Every paranormal investigator has had one of those evenings during an investigation. You're trying to get a reading on your EMF or attempting to find cold or hot spots with the thermal monitor. However, you find absolutely nothing. But you carry on and explore further because you know the history of the house or location, and you're determined to find something, anything to prove that ghosts exist, to verify to the skeptics that there is life after death. I find indoor locations to be the most interesting. They're quiet and enclosed, and you can really see everything within your peripheral vision. What makes it better is that you hear the activity in the other rooms that you can't actually see, making the atmosphere feel incredibly eerie, something that gives paranormal investigators their rush to want more. What a fantastic experience our location was. It was filled with incredibly prepared, determined, and ready investigators, bringing along the necessary equipment that would surely grab the spirit's attention. One of the most pivotal moments in the night was the use of the REM pod. We had all transferred to the second floor, and we had use of the two-bedroom styled rooms. We decided to set up equipment in both rooms. Room 1 had the REM pod located in the center of the room, along with one chair next to the window. We decided to place the pod in this location because investigators had past encounters in this room, feeling the darkness that was located in the corner, emitting the feeling of being watched. And I must admit, going into that room for the first time made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. A paranormal investigator's mind must be prepared to feel all sorts of strange and challenging emotions within a possible haunted area. I suppose it didn't help that the building was physically deteriorating too, emulating an already spooky feeling inside the room. The second room didn't have as much of a threatening feeling as compared to the first one, so we placed a foldable mirror on top of the fireplace, which, along with the dim room, allowed the spirits to travel between the two realms much more easily. I think this gave some of the group a different sense in this room, but at least the doorway to alternate realms wasn't near the raging REM pod. Once everything was in place, we attempted the inverted seance, a highly used practice to try and feel the presence of anything paranormal, either in front of us or around us. What made this a credible execution was having all of the investigators facing out whilst standing in a circle holding hands. You have that knowledge of complete stillness from the group. Additionally, it eliminates the possibility of the potential breathing on one another and accidentally thinking it's a spirit passing you. Everything was in place, and we were ready to start contacting the spirit realm. I could tell some of us were feeling a little uneasy, but we had to push forward. Upon performing the inverted seance, the majority of the investigators felt a sudden increase in temperature, whereby they were sweating and complaining that it was very hot. I, on the other hand, didn't feel this phenomenon. Could I be the one affected at this point, rather than everyone else in the room? It was something I definitely considered. Furthermore, the entire group, including myself, felt extreme dizziness to the point where we all felt like passing out. I'm not sure any of us had felt anything quite as powerful that had the power to affect 8 different people all at once. During this session, the REM pod located in the other room consistently reacted to something in the room. At the beginning of the investigation, we all scanned the area using an EMF reader to see if there was any intrusion of magnetic fields throughout the entire property, for which we received absolutely no readings. Not only that, but the property is known to have very little power running through. At this point in the investigation, I felt as though this could have been one of the most compelling pieces of evidence that we've ever witnessed. We needed someone to go to that room alone with the camera and record it, as it had been detecting some kind of magnetic field for over 10 minutes. Realizing that the REM pod was reacting so vigorously to our seance in the other room, we all decided to move on to part 2 of the experiment, which was to attempt a human pendulum test in which all investigators except one stand in a circle, whilst the last group member stands in the middle. The members creating the circle will ask the spirits, who will respond through the middle member, to sway the central member in a direction that would determine the word yes, and then again for the word no. I had never taken part in the human pendulum in the past, as I had always gone to explore different areas of past investigations, so this was new to me, and I was excited to see how this worked. The group started the experiment. We found this experiment particularly interesting. Not only was the member in the center of the circle responding to the questions, but the REM pod created a different pattern, which only pulsed after we received answers, which was fascinating to see as a first-time participant. We managed to get a clip of the REM pod reacting to nothing in the room. However, we weren't able to collect enough evidence to show the activity that was being performed in the other room. Hopefully, in the future, I'll be much more prepared to show you that the paranormal does indeed exist. This property will definitely be one to return to. Thanks for reading. Faye. When I was a sophomore in college, I lived in an apartment in New York City on Roosevelt Island, which is nestled between Manhattan and Queens. The island has a dark history, and at one point, there were insane asylums and a smallpox hospital. It's actually pretty fascinating if you want to Wikipedia it. But with all of that suffering, the island seems to still carry that burden. So our apartment was laid out in sort of an L shape. The living room / dining room faced part of the hallway. There was a bathroom at the end of the hall that was small and led to the 2 bedrooms, one of which had a balcony off of it. I'm not gonna lie, we had a killer view, and for a dorm, we felt like we were living pretty large. But not long after we moved in, my 3 roommates and I all began to experience some things. It started with the feeling like we were being watched all the time. I remember specifically I was home alone and working on a mural. I was an art student, and I began to feel very uneasy, like someone was right behind me the whole time, just watching me. This went on for about an hour, and I just couldn't shake this feeling, but I did my best to just roll with it. But I'll admit it, I was scared. I was relieved when my roommates got home. As the semester continued, my roommate and I had a huge project due, and in order to accommodate all the space we needed to do it, we took turns working in the living room. I worked on my project first and then headed to bed as my roommate worked on hers. I was laying in my bed, reading with my back to the door, when I saw a shadow come up on my book and felt like someone was behind me. Thinking it was my roommate, I turned to see what she wanted, and she wasn't there. I shrugged it off and kept reading. The shadow once again crept up on my book. I moved my blankets, my head, and the shadow didn't move. At this point, I was scared but felt ridiculous if I mentioned it, so I pulled the covers over my head and just went to sleep. Well, fast forward to Halloween. We had a party and a bunch of friends were over. As the night wore on, we started talking about ghosts and spooky stuff, and lo and behold, it comes up about how everyone thinks our place is a little spooky. My roommate starts to tell a story about how one night we both had a project due and we took turns, and I'm like, wait, where is she going with this? She says she was working on her project and she saw someone out of the corner of her eye walking in the hallway. So she gets up thinking it's me, and it turns out I'm asleep. She goes back to do her project and she feels someone come up on her. All the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, and once again, no one's there. Now, at this point, I'd never mentioned to her what happened to me that same night. I told her my story, and we were both in shock. The more we talk, a few people mentioned feeling like they were going to get pushed off the balcony every time that they went out there. And then it comes out that the two of our friends had the exact same dream when they slept over. They were paralyzed and began floating, and then began to uncontrollably spin. At this point, I'm convinced that something is happening. Sometime later, I began to start seeing a shadow figure often out of the corner of my eye in the hallway. It was dark with no features, and I only ever saw it out of the corner of my eye as it quickly darted when I would look full on. I convinced myself that it was just my eyes until my friend was over. We were sitting at the table talking when I got distracted for a second, and then I saw it. So I took a pause in the conversation, and when I looked at my friend, she said, "I saw it." I said, "Saw what?" And she replied, "The black thing in the hallway." I'd never told her what I saw before, so I felt totally vindicated. The pinnacle of my experiences happened when it was winter break. My roommates had left to go home, and I was the last one there. Not wanting to be alone, I called a friend to stay. We were talking about going out, so I went into the bathroom to brush my teeth, and the door was open because we were still talking. When there was a pause in our conversation, I heard a voice, plain as day, whisper my name loudly and directly into my ear. At this point, I visibly freaked out. I confirmed with my friend that she said nothing, and we decided to leave the apartment for a while. During winter break, I had contacted a few paranormal teams who wanted to check it out after I relayed my story. When we got back from break, I told my roommates, and they were not at all interested and acted like I was nuts, even though we had all those experiences. I regret to this day not just letting them come. So I went to a church, I got some holy water, I sprinkled my apartment and said out loud, "This is my apartment and you're scaring me. That's not okay and you need to go." After that, I didn't feel much of a presence anymore, but maybe I just believed what I did worked and learned to ignore it. I'll never know. I'm a 35-year-old male and currently live in Phoenix, Arizona. I'll try to make this brief and go over a few of my experiences. The first time I can remember anything like this happening to me, I was probably around 15. My family was in the process of moving into a new apartment. Not much was left in our old place besides the essentials, my bed and my TV. I decided to stay the night by myself so I could watch the basketball game. Everything that night seemed the same as it always had. I remember watching the game and opening one of those family-sized Doritos bags. I set the bag down after I ate a few chips, and a few moments later, the bag flew halfway across my room. I picked up the bag and went back to watching the game. I didn't think much of it that night. Maybe I didn't want to think about it at all. At our new apartment, the only strange thing I remember seeing would be out of the corner of my eyes. My dad had a big, bright fish tank. I would routinely see the light being completely blocked by something walking in front of it. It would happen while I was in the kitchen doing dishes, and also while I was in my bedroom playing Xbox. One other thing happened to me that I can't explain. I got real lightheaded one time, and my dad laid me on the couch in the living room. All I could see was white. I heard, "We are all around you." And it scared the living crap out of me, and I just remember thinking, I'm too young to die. Fast forward about 6 years, I had just met my future wife, and after a few months of dating, I had decided to move in with her. We were laying in bed one afternoon, just hanging out. I heard a deep male voice directly in my ear tell me to get out. I looked at her, trying to process what I'd just experienced. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "I heard something, but it wasn't loud enough to make out," she told me. We were less than a foot apart, and it was as if someone was yelling directly into my ear, but she couldn't hear what it had said. A few months later, she was driving me to work around 2 a.m. What she told me sent chills down my spine. She said she had woken up earlier in the night and something was talking to her. She couldn't understand what it was saying. It was a language that she wasn't familiar with. The thought of something I couldn't see that close to where I was sleeping was very unsettling. About a year later, we had moved into a new home together. I awoke one night to a shadow figure standing above me. I reached out to grab what I perceived to be an intruder, and it took a step back and then disappeared. I never went back to sleep that night. On another occasion, I was alone in the house on my tablet one evening. I was laying in bed with my bedroom door open. I heard footsteps in the hall coming towards my bedroom. There were two problems with that. The first being I didn't believe anyone else was in the house, and the second was I should have heard the footsteps long before I did. They started halfway down my hallway. I watched the door, and a few moments later, a tall, shadowy figure passed by. I got up again, thinking that there was someone in my house that shouldn't be. Both rooms outside my room had their doors closed, and there was nowhere else to go. I opened the bathroom door, and it was empty. I opened the door to my spare bedroom, and it was empty as well. 6 years later, and I find myself in a new house with a new experience. It was late one night, probably around 11 p.m. My wife was asleep in our bedroom, and I was sitting on a bed in our spare room with the door open. From where I was sitting, I could see down our hallway. It was dark, but not pitch black. As I sat there scrolling on my phone, something out of the corner of my eye caught my attention. I looked into the hallway, and it was empty. I went back to whatever I was doing on my phone, and a few moments later, I find myself seeing the same thing. I look, but nothing's there. So now I'm back to my phone, but this time I'm trying to focus out of the corner of my eye and figure out what is going on. I see something crawling in my hallway. It's about 10 feet away from where I'm sitting. I look up, and nothing. I go back to my phone, still trying to view it from my peripheral. Now I see that thing standing up. It's a woman wearing a white dress. It's walking in a circle, and I'm trying to process what is happening. It sprints at my door, and just as it gets there, I hit the bedroom light, and it's gone. Now I'm sitting there wondering if I just imagined it. The hair on the back of my neck is standing up, and my heart is beating out of my chest. I'd like to share some background about an incident that happened when I was around 10 years old. In the house where I lived with my mom and my dad and my 5 siblings, we all had experienced various unusual events. The particular event that I'm about to describe happened when I was 10. I was in my 13-year-old brother's room, just hanging out. He was lying on the floor by his bed, and I was about 10 steps away playing with a yoga ball. We had been talking, but he suddenly went quiet, and I assumed he was just tired. After about 5 minutes, I looked over at him and was shocked by what I saw. There was a dark, black mass floating above him, and he appeared to be choking. His eyes were bulging, and his face was turning red. Panicked, I yelled for my mom and started crying. She rushed into the room, and upon seeing him, she grabbed her Bible and began reciting from it. This seemed to work because the black mass eventually disappeared, but not before we heard my brother let out a deep, demonic scream. He laid there with his eyes closed for a while before suddenly sitting up, panting and trying to catch his breath. We left the house that same day and stayed with relatives. However, it seemed like the dark shadow was still with us. We couldn't tell if it had followed us or if it was just the trauma lingering. To be safe, we went to a priest to get the house blessed, and an exorcism was performed on my brother. During the exorcism, his eyes rolled back and he started speaking in an unrecognizable voice. After the exorcism, he seemed to return to his normal self. Our house now has a light and cozy atmosphere. I'm not sure what was targeting us, but it was definitely malevolent. My wife and I went to visit my brother's family in a sleepy Devon town. We stayed in a lovely old cottage that dated back a few hundred years. We were staying in a ground floor bedroom, and my parents were staying in a room opposite. Between us was an old wooden staircase that went up to a lounge. It was a bit of an upside-down house. It all felt very warm, welcoming, and cozy, and my wife and I quickly fell asleep that night. Now, this is where things start to get weird. My wife woke up in the middle of the night, hearing thumping on the wall behind our heads. She was about to wake me up when I apparently sat bolt upright and said, "You can't come in." My wife tried talking to me, but I didn't respond, so she gave me a shake until I woke up. For some context, I don't sleep talk or sleepwalk. Not feeling particularly brave, I didn't want to go out to investigate, so we sat in silence, listening. Eventually, we decided to go back to sleep. In the morning, I decided to try and recreate the thumping sounds that my wife had heard. The wall behind our heads was extremely thick. It was over a meter, and no matter what I did, I couldn't recreate the sounds. Apparently, my thumping was barely audible and muffled compared to the extremely loud and close thumping that my wife heard. Over breakfast, I shared the story with my parents, and apparently the night before, my dad had heard someone going up and down the staircase. They were the only ones in the house, and when he went to look, the footsteps stopped and nobody was there. My brother came along later in the day, and that's when we found out that the building next door was a funeral director's, and the house we were staying in used to be part of the funeral director's building. This is the only paranormal experience I've ever had, but I'm fully convinced that it was the real deal. To this day, I still wonder why that wall was so thick. Seems like a lot of people have scary experiences with Ouija boards. Here's mine. Back on Halloween night in 2019, I was at a party with my friend Alex and a couple of his friends. We were all having a good time, jamming out to spooky Halloween music. We had all been partying pretty good, and some of us were getting tired, but we wanted to play a board or a card game or something to end the night with. One of Alex's friends, who will have to change her name to Lexi for privacy reasons, suggested that we do a Ouija board, like in the movies, she said. Now, I grew up in a pretty standard Christian home and was always warned about Halloween time every year, and to stay away from Ouija boards and blah blah blah, they're evil, blah blah blah. But I didn't really buy into it very much. Well, none of us actually had a Ouija board or knew where to find one, so Lexi suggested that we just make our own. So, of course, being dumb teenagers, we just looked up a design and took a Sharpie and drew one up. Using an old guitar pick as a pointer, we sat down and started asking some questions. At first, the questions were stupid, like, which one of us is the dumbest? Which one of us will make the most money after high school? Just dumb questions that would get us a bunch of no's, like the board was annoyed or something. Well, after a while of asking dumb questions, Lexi thought it would be a good idea to kick it up a notch. Lexi asked the board if there was anyone who would like to talk to us. Then the whole mood in the room changed. It felt colder, and everyone for some reason felt uneasy. The pointer slowly moved over to yes. Almost everyone felt super uncomfortable all of a sudden, but one of our friends, who I'll call Mike, wasn't convinced. He thought someone was just moving the pointer to scare everyone. Mike decided to conduct a little test and asked the board to name a dead relative that no one in the room knew about. And right then, the board spelled out Eleanor. Everyone started freaking out because we all knew Mike's grandmother and her name was Irene. Apparently, Eleanor was his great-great-aunt who had passed on before his mom had died, and at that point, we were all scared and asked what the board wanted. The board started spelling out extremely vulgar obscenities and weird words that no one knew. We quickly said goodbye and ended the session. We turned on the lights and everyone was so freaked out. We threw out the board, and none of us have touched a board since then. About 2 years ago, I was living in a townhouse in a suburban area surrounded by 3 fields. One night, when I was home alone, I started hearing strange noises, like banging on the walls. My mom and her boyfriend were away for the weekend. Initially, I thought it was just my noisy neighbors. Feeling a bit paranoid, I texted my neighbor to see if they were home, but they weren't. That's when my fear really set in. It was around 2 in the morning, I was alone, and the banging noises were growing louder, seeming to come from my basement. I thought it might be my washer, so I went to check, feeling like a cliched character in a horror movie. To my relief, the washer wasn't on. But as I left the basement, panic overwhelmed me again. I went to my room, forgetting about my food, and just sat on my bed. Here's an important detail. My room, which is the master bedroom, has 2 closets, one of which is a walk-in with a barely functioning light. As I lay there, I noticed the light in my walk-in closet was on, which is unusual since it rarely works. Feeling terrified, I hesitantly opened the closet door, only for the light to suddenly shut off. In the dimness, I could just make out a tall, skinny figure at the back of the closet. I quickly closed the door, too scared to scream, and decided to go outside to find a bench to sit on. Recently, just a few days ago, I saw the same figure again, hovering over my bed, staring at me. I was paralyzed with fear. After telling my mom, she mentioned it to her friend who used to live in my apartment and had the same room, and she shared a similar experience, including sleep paralysis. Lately, the lights in my closet have been flickering more, making me think that I've somehow angered this presence. I've never really had any reason to be truly scared. Looking back, there isn't one experience I can think of that really terrified me. I've jumped countless times from sudden loud noises or catching something move in my peripheral vision, but I can't recall ever fully screaming or shouting. But maybe that's because I'm not a very outspoken person anyway, and would rather mask my feelings from others. I lost my eldest daughter once. She was 2 and we were in a B&Q, which is a hardware store. They have model bathrooms and kitchens. There I am, admiring some taps or tiles or whatever it was. I turn around to the shower she was messing in and poof, gone. That was terrifying, but I wasn't scared, more frantic. In full disclosure, I found her taking a dump in one of the display toilets. It's not my proudest moment having to tell the employee that they needed a cleanup in aisle 6. Anyway, so I haven't ever really been terrified, except once. It happened back when I was 17. I'd left school that summer and had 6 weeks before starting college. It was baking hot in the small, rural town that I lived in. Situated pretty much in the middle of England, it's an old coal mining town and a bit of British history here. All the mines were closed down, which decimated both the economy and job opportunities of the small pit towns throughout the country. Back to my town. If you're old enough, or at least look old enough, you spend your time in the local pubs. If you're not, and you have nothing else to do but roam the streets seeking your own entertainment, me and my friends were the latter. On the main road through town, away from other houses, stood a dilapidated house known as the O'Briens. A 4-story, 6-bedroom mansion compared to all the other houses in town. There was an old couple who lived there who, at this point, had passed away some years prior, called, you guessed it, the O'Briens. They had 2 daughters who moved abroad and had never claimed the house, so it just sat, for years, building up dust and rotting away. A perfect opportunity for somewhere cool, private, and exciting for 6 teenagers to hang out in. The house had a ridiculously big back garden, which was equally ridiculously overgrown. It literally took us the good part of a day to stomp down a pathway through the nettles and brush. Once through, there was a garage that we could drop down into, which we pulled up the roof of to gain access. We spent nearly all summer in that house, hanging out, graffitiing the walls, drinking, smoking. You get it. But there was one room that eluded us. From the garage, you headed through a kitchen, which now only consisted of broken windows that had been boarded up and a damaged set of cabinets on the back wall. You then stepped into a hallway which looked right through the front door, with a bathroom and 2 other large rooms on the left-hand side. On the right were the stairs to the 2nd floor. The staircase was built against a wall and had wooden planks running vertically. Directly opposite the kitchen door, built into the back of the staircase, was a large metal door that had been painted white. The paint was now a sickly yellow, dusty color and flaky. The door was locked. It simply wouldn't budge, and looking at the hinges, it opened inwards. The house was big enough that we just kind of forgot about the locked door. We'd spend most days up in the 2 rooms of the 3rd floor away from the road outside to avoid any passersby hearing us and phoning the cops. That was until one of the lads decided, for no apparent reason, to light the moth-ridden curtain on fire with the Zippo that he was messing with. The curtain, the dust-covered carpet, and old crinkled wallpaper went up in seconds. We only made it out by smashing the top window and jumping onto a dirt mound at the side of the garage. I think if adrenaline hadn't been coursing through us, it would have been a hell of a painful fall. We hid in some bushes over the road and watched the fire engine put out the flames, but before that it had engulfed the 2nd and 3rd floor. The second was still usable once we got the courage to re-enter the house, but the third floor was gone. Just the outer walls and what was left of the roof. Shame, really. So we were confined to the bottom floor. The garage was too dark to see in and only had an old table that we'd found that you'd normally use to put paste on wallpaper. We used it to get in and out of the roof. The kitchen wasn't much brighter, and the front room had a big window that overlooked the footpath and road outside, so that left us a small, bleak room to chill in, which got very boring very quickly. Boredom led to curiosity, and I noticed that one of the wooden planks on the side of the stairs was loose, and that there was an open space behind it. Finally, we could see what was behind the metal door, and what a mistake that was. They say curiosity killed the cat, but in this instance, it questioned my whole belief. The wooden panels were surprisingly hard to pull off, even for 6 fairly athletic teenagers. So we went out scouting and brought back a few torches and a crowbar. It was still a slog, but we finally managed to remove 2.5 of the panels. Shining the light into the hole revealed another staircase that led down. Yet it looked as though it was decades older than the rest of the house. Cobwebs engulfed every surface, and the stench of musk and damp attacked your nostrils if you got anywhere near the hole. After some giddy behavior, some pushing and shoving, and a game of rock, paper, scissors, I grabbed a torch and slowly stuck my head through the hole. The room was darker than dark. So dark that the beam from the torch could be seen cutting through the blackness. I shone it down the staircase first, and it went down deep. The hole we had made was maybe 4 or 5 steps from the door, and there were at least 25 feet below it. At the bottom, a wall, and a doorway to the left. I swung the torch to the right, towards the metal door, not expecting to see what I saw at all. The door was definitely locked tight, with 3 separate deadlocks that ran down the side, all barred. But what caught me by surprise was on the small lip of the top step, pushed firmly against the door, was a really outdated fridge. The ones that were squared and about waist high. I told the lads that were stood behind me, and they laughed, thinking I was joking. One by one, they stuck their head in the hole, checked out the bottom of the stairs, and then the fridge, each one as confused as myself. I remember sitting down, smoking a cigarette, and debating how and why it would be there. The door clearly opened inwards, which meant the door must have been locked from the inside, and then somehow the fridge pushed up against it also from the inside. We spent the rest of the day checking the garage and surrounding area of the house for a trap door or maybe another entrance or exit to the cellar, but couldn't find anything. We put it down to the sheer size and state of the garden and went home. The next few visits to the house was just us trying to decide who would enter the cellar first. No one wanted to. And no matter how many games of rock, paper, scissors we played, it was always the best out of a higher number. Until one day, I'd had enough. We were sat in a circle in the other room, messing with stuff and just generally chatting. Except me. I was sat and stared at the hole, this dark void in the wall. Finally, I got up, exclaimed my intentions, took the torch from my pocket, and stepped inside. Everyone else quickly and very excitedly followed. Immediately, the first few layers of the wooden steps just disintegrated under my feet. They turned into mulch of damp splinters that clung to the sole of my shoe when I lifted my foot. It was worrying, but the stairs seemed sturdy enough. Each step I took downwards, the temperature dropped rapidly, and the air seemed to get thicker and thicker. The inches of dust that I kicked up didn't help either. Admittedly, I was a little scared, but I had 5 other dudes behind me, so it was impossible to turn tail now. I headed down and reached the second to last step. I could see the doorway, which led to an open room. Pausing, I regained my courage with a few shaky, deep breaths and I stepped through. The room was in a worse state than the stairs. Webs littered the rafters and floorboards above like moss. They hung from the ceiling in clumps, all tarnished with dust. Weirdly, thinking about it now, actually, we never saw any spiders though. The floor was carpeted in a layer of debris from the rotting wood above, and dust and dirt. It was a miracle that none of us ever fell through the floor above. This place was a mess. The room was huge, expanding underneath the bathroom and both rooms on the first floor, and it was dark. There was no light source other than the torches that the three of us now carried. The room stood empty, except for a wooden table smack bang in the middle. No chair, nothing around it. But on the table was a metal plate, crudely bashed into shape with the remnants of black goo on it. Next to the plate stood a tall, uncorked green bottle. One of the boys went over to it and picked it up. It sloshed as he did so, with the liquid of deep brown and layers of dirt inside. I never smelled it, but apparently it was putrid. At first, we didn't see the other doorway. It was in the corner, directly opposite the one that we had entered. No door, just total darkness. We tried to shine our torches through it, but they didn't seem to cut through the shadows. It was like there was actually a door there, one that drained the torchlight. For some reason, I didn't muster the courage to go into that room, and neither did anyone else. We simply turned and left, feeling like we'd had enough adventure for the day. Over the next week or so, we invited girls and other friends to the house, but all refused to enter the basement. We found this to be hilarious and would dare one another, more to show off than anything, to go down there either on our own or in pairs without a flashlight and see how long we could stay down there. Now, not once did I get scared while stood in complete darkness down there. It was kind of calming, actually, but none of us ever got the courage to enter the other room. In hindsight, we should have questioned more why the door was metal, or why it was locked from the inside, and how a fridge got up the stairs and placed in front of the door as a barrier from the inside as well. But full of excitement and immaturity, it never crossed our minds. We just assumed that there would be some sort of other exit in the room, which led to the garden. Word quickly went round through the year groups of the O'Brien basement, and we definitely fed the rumors of it being haunted. Teenagers would ask us how to get into the house and for us to show them the barricaded door. So, because we thought we were cool, we spent another day making a maze in the garden, squashing pathways down that led away from the garage. We would then invite people into the house, lead them through the garden, into the garage, and show them the hole in the stairs. It got quite popular, and we decided to cash in on the opportunity. We told people that if they wanted to see the basement, then they would have to do the initiation. As they came in, we would have one person sat in the fridge and another at the bottom of the stairs, both with torches, and send people into the first room, telling them that they had to stay there for 10 minutes with the torches turned off, and then we would let them out. This went on for a while, and it was fun at first. A lot of people bottled it as soon as the torches were turned off, but some stayed. We'd cheers them back up the stairs when they completed it. It was a cheesy little ritual that we had created, but still, everyone refused to go into the other room. When questioned, they just said that they didn't feel comfortable. Until my little brother and his friend came. They were 2 years younger than us, and initially, we refused to let anyone who wasn't at our age into the house. We were there all the time, and there were 6 of us in the friend group, so it was pretty easy to deter people away if they managed to find the entrance at the garage. But after constant pestering and the initial curiosity of others dwindling, we decided to invite them along. We made a big deal out of it, taking them to the dilapidated fence at the back of the garden and tying their jumpers around their faces as we led them blind through the maze of shrubbery and thorns to the garage. It was a decent drop from the hole in the roof, and even though my brother managed it, his friend had to be lowered down by his arms. Once inside, they were met with the stench of smoke that lingered from the floors above. We walked them through the kitchen and showed them the makeshift entrance to the basement. We told them the story of the metal door and how it didn't make sense, and gave them the option of staying in the first room in pitch black for 10 minutes or go in the second room in pitch black for 5 minutes, which is an offer a lot of people initially picked until they got down the staircase. "Second room," they both said in unison. We all laughed, expecting them to change their minds immediately. One of the lads slipped through the hole in the wooden boards and turned right, heading up the stairs and positioning himself on the fridge. I went through the next and positioned myself at the foot of the stairs. And I'd just like to say that at this point, all of us regulars felt complete comfort going down to the bottom of the stairs, practically alone. I mean, we'd all taken it in turns when bringing people down here and had done it numerous times each, so this time was really no different. There was a giddy, nervous atmosphere when the two youngsters entered the staircase. The torches we used were cheap ones that we'd gotten from the market, so they cast an eerie yellow glow. Slowly, my brother and his friend made it down the stairs, clearly attempting to show face and act unmoved by the state of the rotten, decaying wood around them. But as they trenched through the mulch, they stuck close together. They took their time, so much so that the guy at the top shouted for them to hurry, and both nearly crapped their pants. When they finally got to me, I told them that this was the first room, shining the torch around the room through the doorway, and that they were to go into the next room, aiming the beam through the darkness to the frame of the other door. The room was a decent size, and as stated, the torches were cheap. But I remember taking notice that the beam that cut through the first room never seemed to illuminate the second room at all, as if there was an object obstructing its path. My brother's friend walked into the room, and as my brother walked past me, I grabbed his shoulder and told him that he didn't have to do this, and if he did, then he could back out whenever. With a nod and a dismissive wave, he followed his friend. They crossed the room, passed the table, and disappeared through the second doorway, as if walking through a dark stage curtain. I hit the button on my Casio watch to start the countdown from 5 minutes. I then aimed the beam of my torch up the staircase. The guy sitting on the fridge smiled excitedly and looked at his watch. "I really need to piss, dude. I'll be right back," he said, jumping down from the fridge and then disappearing back through the gap. I stood at the bottom of those steps for what seemed like forever. I could hear the faint giggles from across the first room, and they seemed muffled, as if hearing voices from behind a door. "How long left?" my brother's voice shouted. 3.5 minutes, I replied, checking my watch. Now, in the basement, despite it obviously being underground, there was never an uncomfortable temperature. It was colder than upstairs, but it never had any bite. There was never a chill, I mean. And while being down there countless amounts of times, not once had any of us felt any sort of breeze. But, and this memory still haunts me a little, especially when there's a sudden shift in temperature, I noticed that I became very cold as I stood at the bottom of the stairs, to the point where I could see my breath when checking the time against the light on my watch face. The mumbles from the other room had stopped also. I tried to focus on them, see if I could hear any movement or any nervous noises that they had been making before, but nothing. I remember getting freaked out, and I don't know what about, but I could feel my heart beating faster. The hairs on my arms and the back of my neck stood on end. I turned on the torch and stepped into the first room. "Yo, you guys all right?" I called out, but nothing. No reply. "Hey, stop messing around, your time's up," I called out again. But again, no reply. I shined the torch through the doorway of the second room, but just like before, it was as if the beam cut through the first room and then stopped at the doorway. I crept closer, calling my brother's name, but he never replied. Then, as clear as day, so loud that it hurt my ears after the silence, a voice, deep, brash, and distorted, as if the sound had been twisted, bellowed, "Leave now." I froze on the spot, my eyes fixated on their doorway, and then emerging from the gloom ran my brother and his friend, both as white as snow, both with tears and snot streaming down their faces. The look of pure terror on their faces is something that I've never been able to get rid of. They bolted straight past me, which snapped me out of the trance, and I followed suit. Before we could reach the doorway to the stairs, the sound of crashing came from the stairwell. 4 ridiculously loud bangs and the noise of snapping wood. The fridge was embedded into the wall at the bottom of the staircase. Without stopping, we all scrambled over it. The staircase itself was a complete mess. Large splinters of wood stuck up like spikes. Luckily, and I don't know how, we managed to clamber up on our hands and feet without any injury. Halfway up, I looked towards the hole in the wall, praying it would be in reaching distance. Both the young lads were in front of me, both still sobbing and screaming. They both ran straight past the hole in the wall, and the metal door, which was locked before with no key, stood open. Light from the garage exit spilled through the kitchen and down into the basement, as if it showed us the quickest way out. Instinct had set in by this point, and all 3 of us darted through the door, onto the table, and then up through the garage. My brother's friend, too small to get down on his own, managed to get out without help. We ran through the garden maze. At some point, I had to grab a hold of my brother to stop him from going down one of the many dead ends that we had created, and without word, took the lead. We raced to the fence, squeezed through the hole, and collapsed on the field behind the property. I looked around, and there, also sat on the grass staring at the 3 of us, was everyone else who had been in the house. No one said a word. Everyone looked as scared as each other, except for the 2 younger boys. They wept, for a long time actually, as we all just sat there in silence and let them do it. Once they had stopped, we all got up, without a word, and went home. My brother said nothing to me on the way or when we got back. He just went into his room, I went into mine, and that was the end of that. No one went into the house again. It stood for a year or 2 and then it was demolished. Apparently, one of the daughters had finally come over and claimed the land, only to sell it to some new build project. Now, a group of houses sit where the garden and house were. Nice looking houses, to be fair. But my brother still refuses to walk past that estate. They never built on the land directly above the cellar. Apparently, and I've never actually had this confirmed, but the builders refused to fill the cellar in for some reason. They just bricked it up and left it as open space despite being able to fit a perfectly good house on there. We only brought it up once within the friends group, and only because I convinced myself that it had been one of them that had opened the door and somehow moved the fridge. But they all swore it wasn't. They said that as soon as it started getting really cold in there, they got spooked. They heard the voice and then headed for the kitchen, noticed the door was open when they heard the loud bangs, and then bolted. I tried asking my brother about the room, but he completely shut down when I did. He quickly stopped being friends with the kid who went down to the second room with him. They said they no longer had anything relevant to talk about. I've kind of been obsessing over what happened out there. I'll try and keep it as brief as possible without leaving out key details. My wife's uncle, Jay, bought some land just north of Spokane, Washington, with a friend of the family. Goes by Kay. They got it at a significant discount because a nearby aluminum smelter had polluted the ground and it was impossible to use the water beneath the ground. They had set up 2 plots and each had a camper to live in. Jay had been progressively getting paranoid and saying people were stalking him and watching him in the trees. About 3 months into living there, a man wandering through the woods had an interaction with Jay and ended up attacking him and breaking his jaw. Upon being arrested, the man was overcome with the desire to see if he could kill him with a single punch. 2 months later, Jay was murdered and asleep on the couch in his camper. Kay found him and immediately ran as far away until he stopped to call the police. There was sufficient evidence of who did it, and they quickly caught the killer, who was a 19-year-old boy who said he simply wanted his bike. He beat him to death with a power tool that was lying on a floor nearby, completely bashed his brains in. Kay was terrified at all times to be there alone. He had moved in with a family member until 8 months later, he ended up with nowhere else to go and then had to return. In constant fear, he finally convinced my pregnant wife and I to come stay with him. The second I turned off the highway onto the property, I was overcome with dread. There were at least 250 crows covering the dirt road up to the property. I didn't sleep whatsoever the first night. I stared into the forest searching for the cause of my intense fear. The energy of this place was so uncomfortable, and I assumed it was simply just knowing Uncle Jay was killed here. Even the days were eerie. Never did I have a moment where I didn't feel like I was being watched. My wife and I always had this sense of fear, especially after dark. Things sort of normalized for a while until one day, Kay began puking and feeling very lightheaded all the time. I took him to the hospital and they said he was fine, probably just a flu. At this point, it was the anniversary of Jay's murder. 3 days after the date of Jay's death, Kay comes running out of his camper, screaming, "I can't breathe," waking my wife and I up, and we run to see what's wrong. Kay had gotten into his car and floored it, crashing into a nearby tree. I run up and peer through the window to see the most intense and most primal fear I've ever seen in anyone's eyes. He was gasping and clutching his chest. Moments later, he breathed out one last time, and he was dead. We gave him CPR for 30 minutes until EMS arrived. On July 10th, 1 year and 3 days after moving there with Jay, and they were both dead. Now it's only me and my wife alone on the property, every moment living in fear and not understanding what had happened here. I don't know why we didn't leave right away. One day, I come out to get fresh water from a drum that we kept for water to smell the worst smell that I've ever smelled. The water container had a 1-inch opening on top, and inside the water was bits and pieces of chipmunks, like spines and heads. They didn't fall in. Something ripped them apart before putting them inside. The nights were getting worse and worse. I never saw anything, just always filled with unease and intense fear. I grew up deep in the mountains of North Idaho, with the nearest town being 30 miles away. Fear in the woods, even at night, is new for me. Hearing crashing and footsteps every night. One night, my wife and I returned home to having the worst feeling I've ever felt. Everything looked different, although everything was right where we had left it and nothing seemed out of place. Looking around, I suddenly see this orange, long-haired, manged cat sitting on a stump. This cat's eyes were so intense, fiery, almost glowing, but not quite. We start hearing branches snapping, pine needles crunching, seemingly from every direction. I'm still staring at this cat, almost frozen in fear. Suddenly, a voice breaks out, echoing through the forest. "Hello? Is anyone here?" A little girl, I thought, but something was off. My wife yells back, "Hello, are you okay? Anybody?" The voice had changed. "Help, help me." We yell back several times without any response. "Somebody freaking help me!" The most intense, shrieking, evil-sounding voice of a woman. I'm now filled with more intense fear than I can ever describe, but my wife, she's overcome with the need to find this person, and she started to head off into the forest without a word. I grabbed her by the arm and tell her something isn't right. Why won't she respond to us? She tries to break free from me and go off alone. I tell her to get into the truck and I'll grab the spotlights because we're not going on foot. We roll the windows down and shine my intensely bright LED lights throughout the forest. We slowly creep down the road, yelling back. As we get further down the road, the voice strikes out, "Please, won't anyone freaking help?" Sounds are difficult to pin down in the woods, but this one was very close. I hit the brakes and stop immediately. We shine the lights and yell back, searching. No sign of anyone, when suddenly the voice explodes into the cabin of the vehicle as if they were standing right outside my window. "Help me, somebody help," leaving my ears hurting and ringing. I hit the gas and I didn't look back. I called the police when I hit the highway, and afterwards they said there was no one around. I picked up our stuff the next day and my wife gave birth the following day. We never stayed there again after that baby was born. And what the hell could do these things? I never even believed in paranormal things at all before, but I don't know what else happened. This is a heartwarming, real story that my family likes to retell when times are rough, and I thought I'd share it with you. Before my dad was married to my mom, he was in a previous marriage to another woman who was honestly evil incarnate. Together, they had my stepsister who was severely handicapped. She was confined to a wheelchair, couldn't speak, and she had to have everything done for her, including being bathed and having her diaper changed. Since my dad's ex was a very terrible, abusive person, he eventually divorced her and got full custody of their children. For years, he would take care of my sister and sing to her "Every Rose Has Its Thorn" by Poison as she would giggle with joy every time he did. It was their song. He took care of her and sung to her every day until she was 15 years old when she passed away. I was only 2 at the time, so I didn't have any defining memories with her, just pictures. During the funeral, it rained hard, but when my dad got in the car to head to the cemetery to bury her, a rainbow came out from behind the clouds. It was the brightest he'd ever seen, and he heard the DJ say on the radio, "This song is from a little girl to her daddy, letting him know that everything is going to be all right." And guess what song came on? "Every Rose Has Its Thorn" by Poison. Now, we've asked many family members if they called in to request the song, but no one's owned up to it. My father truly believes it was his little girl telling him that she was okay, wherever she was.